Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to another IISS Japan Chair Program webinar. As ever, a special thanks to you who are getting up early or staying up late to join this session. You are a very global audience, so we're very grateful that you're taking the time to join us. I'm Robert Ward, the IISS Japan Chair and Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy here at the IISS, and I'll be chairing today's webinar. The topic of today's discussion is the geopolitics of trade and investment regulation. This session, I think, is particularly timely given the significant potential changes in US trade policy and regulations from 2025 as the second Trump administration gets underway. These changes in the US will come against a background of an already challenged global trade and regulatory environment. In recent years, we've seen US-China trade friction, major disruptions from the COVID-19 pandemic and from Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, as well as the threat to global shipping from the instability in the Middle East. It's thus not surprising that governments and businesses in Japan, the EU, US, and elsewhere are increasingly preoccupied with economic security and building resilience. But the concept of economic security is ambiguous, making it difficult to reconcile security concerns with economic interests. There's no clear definition or consensus of what constitutes national security. This fluidity allows governments to intervene freely in the market in the name of national security concerns, but also impedes international coordination in economic security. And this in turn creates additional complexity for companies operating across borders. In this webinar, the IISS Japan Chair is delighted to host three distinguished guests calling in from Tokyo, London, and Canberra to discuss the geopolitics of trade and regulations from their own regional perspective. As well as dissecting the individual strategies of Europe and the Indo-Pacific, our webinar hopes to illuminate the potential areas for international cooperation in navigating this complex environment. Before I introduce our fantastic guests, I'd like to explain a few of the house rules for today's session. This webinar will last for 1 hour. After introducing the speakers, each speaker will speak for around 7 minutes, touching on the various elements of economic security policy with a particular focus on trade and investment regulations. We'll then begin a short discussion followed by some time for Q&A for our audience. We'll be using Zoom's Q&A function that can be found at the bottom of your screens as you are being shown now. Thank you. And you're very welcome to type your questions in at any time. Please, though, do state your affiliation and your name when writing a question. It's helpful for our guests to know who they're addressing when they answer your questions. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers in the order in which they will speak. First, we have Watai Rikako, who is calling in from Tokyo today. Rikako Sensei is a professor of administrative law at Keio University Law School in Tokyo and a member of the New York Bar. Since 2020, Rikako has also taught Japanese law as an affiliate professor at the University of Washington School of Law in Seattle, and her research focuses on the comparative analysis of regulations governing foreign direct investment in the US and Japan, and she's written extensively on this topic in both Japanese and English. Among Rikako's recent publications is a paper titled Japan's Response to the Trade Conflict Between the United States and China, which was published in the Washington International Law Journal. A warm welcome, Rikako.
Thank you so much.
Our second speaker is Sam Lowe. Sam is a partner at Flint Global, a consultancy, where he heads the trade and market access practice. Other strings to Sam's bow include being a senior visiting research fellow at the Policy Institute, King's College London, delivering training for UK government trade officials, and writing a weekly Substack trade newsletter called Most Favoured Nation. Sam was previously a member of the UK government's Strategic Trade Advisory Group and has held positions as a senior advisor to the Blakeney Group and as a senior research fellow at the Centre for European Reform. Sam tells us that he spent his honeymoon in Japan, which we're very pleased about, on the Japan Chair Programme, and spent some time working in Greenland. So you have a truly international spread for us of interest for us, Sam, and a very warm welcome to the webinar. And our third guest is Helen Mitchell, calling in from Canberra. Helen is a Sir Rowland Wilson Scholar at the Australian National University's National Security College researching economic statecraft. She's an economist, a former diplomat, most recently a senior expert providing strategic advice to the Australian Prime Minister and the Australian government. Helen has pioneered a modern economic statecraft framework to illuminate state actions that can drive prosperity and add to regional deterrence and influence. She's also a non-resident fellow in the United States Studies Centre's Economic Security Programme at the University of Sydney, where she's published an excellent report that defines what economic security is and how to achieve it. The report is called Unlocking Economic Security, Strategic Playbook for Australia. And Helen is also musical, plays keyboard in a band of fellow economic security experts on economic security themes. So we always like a warm welcome to musical people as well to our webinars. So welcome everybody. And without more ado, I'd like to ask Rikako Sensei to give her comments. Over to you.
Thank you very much for having me today. It's such an honor for me to take part in the IISS webinar. And I will briefly introduce Japan's investment regulations. They are based on Foreign Exchange and Foreign Trade Act, FEFTA. But the structure of the law is very complex and often compared to an old building with many renovations, making it feel like a maze. So there have been many amendments to investment regulations as well. The recent amendments were made to align with the movements in the United States, aiming to ensure economic security. Japan's Economic Security Promotion Act was established in 2022, and measures are being taken to ensure economic security from two aspects. One is strategic autonomy, and the other is strategic indispensability. So strategic autonomy involves strengthening the foundations essential for maintaining Japan's socio-economic activities to reduce excessive dependency on other nations. So this is essentially a defensive stance, including measures such as strengthening supply chains and protecting critical infrastructure. On the other hand, strategic indispensability is an offensive approach aimed at expanding Japan's essential role in the international community. So this includes systems for enhancing the development of critical technologies. So investment regulations are crucial in both aspects. So let me discuss the specifics of Japan's investment regulations. First, the definition of foreign investor includes individuals who are non-residents, foreign companies, and Japanese companies that are 50% or more owned by these entities. So the status of a foreign investor is based on residency rather than nationality. So if a person has lived in Japan for more than 6 months, they are not considered a foreign investor, even if they are a foreign national. So this has raised concerns from a national security perspective. So next, it's necessary to pay attention to whether the Japanese company being invested is classified as a designated industry. If it's not a designated industry, after the fact reporting is sufficient. So Japan is the member of OECD, and the purpose of the FEFTA advocates for the freedom of foreign direct investment. So designated industries are divided into core industries and non-core industries, and both require prior notification in principle. So, however, there are exemptions. So for non-core industries, foreign investor can exempt from prior notification if they do not take executive roles, suggest business transfers at shareholders' meetings, or access non-public technical information. And in core industries, there are additional criteria for exemption, requiring foreign investors to avoid participating in major decision-making committees and to refrain from submitting proposals with set deadlines to the board of directors. So these measures are designed to safeguard the autonomy of Japanese companies. The overall goal is to ensure that management decisions remain independent. The Ministry of Finance first issued a list of listed companies classified under core industries in 2020, and the sixth revised version was released this September. The proposed acquisition of Japan's Seven & I Holdings by a Canadian corporation has sparked much debate, as you may know. And Seven & I was designated as a core industry in the September revision. So given that Seven & I is now subject to prior notification and, of course, review, there may be speculation about possible government intervention. However, I believe the action is driven solely by the requirements of Economic Security Promotion Act. The Act's inclusion of additional specified critical products led to Seven & I being classified as core industry. So when prior notification is made, the Minister of Finance and the Minister having jurisdiction over the business conduct the review. The review criteria are whether it would impair national security, public order, or public safety, and the factors to be considered as published by the Ministry of Finance clearly emphasize whether foreign control extends to core industries. The Ministry of Finance issued its first annual report on investment screening, noting that there were 2871 prior notifications in 2023, 399 applications withdrawn, and 629 exemptions from making prior notice. So there has been only one instance in which an investment was ordered to cease. This involved TCI, a British investment fund, which attempted to increase its shareholding in J-Power, Japan's largest wholesale electricity provider. So the order was issued due to potential impact on Japan's energy policy. So investment screening has been lenient until now. And looking ahead, I expect that under the policy of promoting economic security, the strengthening of regulations will continue. In particular, there may be cases where exemptions from prior notification will no longer be available. While national security has been an exception in international economic law over the years, I have the feeling that it has now become a mainstream regulation. And finally, the US Steel deal. It's not directly related to Japan's regulations, but its outcome is likely to influence the investment behavior of Japanese companies. So it will also raise questions about the credibility of US investment regulations, which may ultimately affect the approach to regulations in Japan as well. Thank you so much. I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Rikako Sensei. Thank you for reminding us about strategic autonomy and strategic indispensability as well, because they're quite important terms within Japanese economic security discourse. I was interested in your discussion of Seven & I Holdings as well, and the definition of what is a core industry. So I may come back to that as well, and I'm sure we've got some questions on the Nippon Steel, US Steel case. But so thank you for that, Rikako. And if I move next to Sam, please.
Thank you very much, Robert. And I suppose I'm coming at this from a European perspective, which in the first instance, it means I have to avoid lingering for too long on attempting to define economic security, given that I'm not sure there is a widely understood definition in Europe, possibly globally, and people view it differently. I suppose from the perspective of this presentation, I'm going to be focusing more on the economic side of it than the security side, or even to frame it slightly differently on the defensive measures being imposed by Europe. So in terms of, so this is largely regulatory or trade intervention designed to guard against Chinese overcapacity or lack of competitiveness or lack of autonomy, to use one of the phrases Robert just introduced to the conversation, rather than the more offensive measures designed to influence the actions of others, which I'd probably put in that category, sanctions or export controls. And of course, you can argue about my delineation and whether I've put things in the right place, but just to I suppose, frame where I'm coming from. And in a European context, when we discuss economic security, we are often talking about regulatory and trade interventions with a focus on competitiveness. I mean, just to give, I suppose, a bit of a list of the different tools that have been introduced by the European Union over the last few years. You have the anti-coercion instrument. So this is an instrument that allows the EU to penalise countries or entities that are deemed to be putting undue pressure on EU member states or companies. So the classic example of this while it was being developed was the response of the Chinese government to Lithuania acknowledging Taiwan's embassy within its territory, and then finding itself struck off Chinese customs as an entity, so it ceased to exist from a customs perspective. So it was to grant powers to allow the EU to respond to that. You also have other new interventions, such as the foreign subsidies regulation, which allows the EU to intervene in the event companies operating within the EU market are deemed to be benefiting unfairly from foreign state subsidies. So that could be in the context of mergers and acquisitions, or in the context of procurement, or just in general activities. And that has been it's been brought into force and has started to be used. For example, investigations were initiated into procurement activities linked to Chinese companies in the context of rail transport in Eastern Europe, leading to the companies to withdraw. So we hasn't followed the investigation through to conclusion. You also have sort of more technical measures, such as the enforcement regulation, which is linked to WTO disputes, but it allows the EU to retaliate in the event a country appeals into the void, which is sort of how we refer to what happens to disputes in the context, in WTO disputes in the context of there being no functioning appellate body. You also have other regulatory measures that you can argue about whether they're classified as economic security or not. But they're certainly viewed by the EU as important in terms of maintaining a level playing field. You've got the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is intended to ensure that imports into the EU are subject to a carbon price equivalent to that imposed on European-based producers. You have the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which forces firms to identify and address labour and human rights and environmental issues through the supply chain. Linked to that, you have the incoming forced labour regulation. You also have deforestation rules. All of this is designed to guard against the it's to guard the economic security of Europe, by one definition. One point I would make is that, and I think it's important given the time we're having this conversation, is in the context of the recent development of these regulations and the recent European discussions of economic security, most of the focus has been on China. However, actually, most of these instruments were developed initially or envisioned under Trump presidency 1, and they are non-discriminatory, and they were very much originally had the US in mind. Given the presidential election, the conversation in Europe has quickly returned to discussing the US. And while these measures and the concept of economic security is usually raised in the context of China, or has been recently, I don't expect that to continue. I think I think Donald Trump and the US becomes a big part of that in the European discourse, which is obviously uncomfortable for some. In terms of wider considerations, I mean, it's perhaps slightly instructive to think about the conversation in relation to the recent anti-subsidy tariffs applied to imported Chinese electric vehicles, where this is obviously something the EU and other countries have faced pressure from the US to do. The EU's approach to imposing these tariffs was to conduct an anti-subsidy investigation under the existing trade rulebook, and to the extent possible, conduct that in a legally defensible manner. The tariffs, the investigation found evidence of unfair subsidization in China, and this has led to countervailing duties applied at different levels to the companies that were included in the investigation, and at a general higher level to those that weren't. The tariffs that have been applied, no one actually thinks they will stop Chinese electric vehicles entering the European Union. They will make them slightly less competitive than they were before, and perhaps slow down the rate of uptake within Europe, but they're not going to halt them. And this is a different approach to what we've seen in the US, where the tariffs are at a level where it's just nearly impossible to sell them competitively into the US, and it's combined with other legislation in relation to, for example, data and hardware, which, when it comes into force, will essentially make it impossible to place some of these products on the market at all. It is a different approach, and one of the reasons for this is there is a tension within Europe between different objectives. So we've been talking about economic security, but there is also the commitment to the green transition, and this does play out quite a lot in the economic security space, whereby often the products we end up discussing, not always, but often seem to be products involved with the green transition. And in order to meet decarbonisation targets, it would be helpful if you could access the cheapest available products. And those are quite often Chinese. And the sort of one of the places where this is playing out quite acutely within Europe is not within the EU, but in the UK. So the UK has not instigated an investigation into Chinese electric vehicles. And if you look at the design of the UK scheme to incentivize the decarbonisation of road transport, so it's something called the ZEV mandate, you can actually argue it is dependent on the increased import of Chinese electric vehicles and the placement on the market, both in order to bring the price point down, but also in terms of how this scheme is designed, whereby in the early years, those producers that don't meet the requirements can buy credits off those who do, which essentially means that most producers are going to end up having to buy credits either off Tesla or Chinese manufacturers. So you actually end up creating inadvertently a scheme in which arguably some of the vehicles that are already receiving great subsidies at home are also being cross-subsidized by the European state that's importing them. And it creates tensions within government, where you have the economic security focused people thinking, well, we need to intervene to do something about this. And then you have the climate and energy people saying, actually, we don't. It's doing exactly what we want. And there's lots to talk about. I will stop there. I think we're going to discuss the European response to possible response to Trump in the questions, which is largely a conversation that involves scenario planning rather than any certainty, but it's at least interesting.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you for listing out the instruments, and again for reminding us that these instruments were set up under Trump 1 as well. I think that's a nice bit of context for us. I was struck by your comment at the end there as well about different bits of government having different views on strategic issues. And it strikes me that economic security is absolutely sort of voracious beast, and it goes everywhere and tries to eat everything. But effective economic security requires governments working across cooperation within government, across government rather, to be most effective. So perhaps we come back to that if we have time.
Sorry, just to carry on that, because I mentioned the green folk, if you also just have the national security people. So in the context of, say, economic security and export controls, their answer is just to say no to everything, right? But then you have the business people who are like, well, can we find a middle ground? So you have these tensions popping up everywhere.
Yes, and successful implementation of policy requires everyone to be on the same page. Yeah, good point there, Sam. Thank you. And Helen, over to you, please.
Great, thank you for having me, Robert, and really nice to be on the panel with Rikako Sensei and with Sam. I will caveat up front by saying I'm an economist, but I think it would be helpful in my comments. I'll try and talk a little bit to how also strategists in Australia are seeing what's driving global economic security policies, and give you a sense of how the Australian government is trying to balance its economic security responses to those global dynamics and to the sort of policies and instruments that are being used. So I would say that in Australia, there is a really keen sense, given where we sit in the region and given our strategic alliance with the United States, but our very high trade dependence on China. So the bulk of Australian exports go to China in value terms, and it's very important for economic growth in Australia. So that's our sort of simplified strategic and economic setup. The view from Australia really is that with this shift in global power, sort of balance of power dynamics, and at the same time, the US sort of turning inward. And I think we've seen a really strong example of that in the resounding result for a much more isolationist president in the US with President Trump. Australia sees this as making its strategic environment more difficult to navigate. So not being able to rely on, the sort of the rules that used to kind of set the rules of the road in the region. And at the same time, we have interests in Australia in thinking about deterrence measures. So thinking about that changing global balance of power, like Japan being in the region, well, not as close as Japan, but being close to sites like the South China Sea and just East Asia generally, we think a lot in Australia about what that means for our strategic environment, not just from a purely sort of military and conflict perspective, but really from an economic perspective. So thinking about potential contingency scenarios, not just Taiwan, but more broadly in the region, Australia thinks really carefully about what that means for most of our trade, things like our outbound energy supplies to countries like Japan and Taiwan and others, but also our inbound trade as well would be severely disrupted by anything that went on in that region. And of course, we sort of got in Australia, like everywhere else, we got a test run of that during the pandemic. Like everywhere else, we saw that this disruption to supply chains means that there is this inherent risk in the way that we set up for good reason over time, very efficient, but very complex and interdependent production lines all around the world. Then at the same time, Australia does think a lot about China, of course, not just because it's our major trading partner, but as the big, important, growing power in the region with a very significant, of course, navy. And what Australia really sees is that China has been on a path to seeking some, maybe to steal that term from Rikako sensei for a minute, that sort of economic autonomy, or maybe economic resilience would be the word, for some time. So China's economy, while continuing, of course, to grow and feed the world important exports of all kinds of products, there have been signs in China over the last decade or so of an intent to also safeguard the economy and for China itself to be strategic and thinking about its own autonomy and not having too much dependence in its relationships as well. So then broadly, the strategic picture of all of this added up is that we're worried about the potential for conflict in our region, but at the same time, using economic measures, whether it's partly for deterrence purposes, things like the US using export controls for a range of reasons, but part of it is also to slow down China's development of advanced technologies in areas like AI, which could be critical on the battlefield, for example. But it's also, the goals of those policies are also about US domestic goals as well, of course, and about positioning its industries for those really important supply chains of the future. But all that means that from the Australian perspective, we would probably see in our national interest that some of that competition and that change in the balance of power taking place by economic means would perhaps be a bit preferable to, escalating conflict in the region. And thinking, of course, about when nuclear powers are involved, that's really not a situation where countries want to start using force and risking escalation. So I think there's a sense to sort of give strategists their due. I think that there is a sense that sometimes using economic means can be preferable if you see them as helping to add to deterrence and take us away from potentially dangerous situations. But that being said, as we all know, at the same time, in lots of countries around the world, domestic policies and inward pressures are actually driving protectionist policies at the same time. So just echoing the other panelists that we can't always be sure why governments are using certain instruments, and it may well be a mix of reasons, and sometimes some of it protectionist, as well as maybe national security and broader economic interests. So the Australian view really of that situation is that this is not our preferred version of events, right? We were happy, thank you very much, with the kind of post-World War II, fairly rules-based sort of order that was working in our favor. The US was sort of leading trade liberalization and underpinning stability in the system, partly through military means, but also through economic and diplomatic means. And, a very different situation now with China's rise being so important for the world economically, but also, of course, its military power growing, which does necessitate sober assessments of what that means for security in the region. So I'll really just finish now by giving you a few highlights about how Australia is responding to this environment. Australia is actually doing things like Japan, the sort of autonomy and indispensability model. For example, Australia has a foreign investment review board that's just basically foreign investment screening. You kind of see the tension in policymakers in Australia trying to balance the economic benefits of those sort of resource flows of finances with foreign investment with their security concerns of investments that could take place in critical infrastructure or in sensitive parts of the economy. And you see that in this balancing act, our Foreign Investment Review Board tries to actually speed up investment decisions and make them as seamless as possible. But at the same time, they're making calculations with every foreign investment that potentially comes in about whether there are security concerns associated with that. And then to give an example of Australia, sort of in the vein of Japan's indispensability push, we've actually gone down the route in Australia of a big push on renewable energy. Australia has huge capacity for wind and solar production that once produced onshore can then be used in industries like green steel, for example, that are going to become more important as over time the world does shift to a new renewable energy system. Australia will sort of be in good stead through these policies to be a major beneficiary actually of that change. So that's part of the indispensability to our region. Those would be some recent policies Australia has taken. And I'll just finish by saying on Robert's point before as well, about sort of needing to talk about basically balancing the economic and the security imperatives in these policy settings. Australia has made moves towards this, both trying to bring across more parts of government together and also really reaching out to businesses, right, who are on the front lines of this and trying to both give them a sense of what the government is seeing in terms of geopolitics and the global economic environment, but also trying to pull in information from firms who sometimes really know what's going on. So there have been some advances in that in the Australian government, not as far as something like the Japanese government that has a specific body set up to think about economic security, but some steps along that road. I'll finish there.
Thank you, Helen, for that. That was comprehensive, setting out where Australia's geopolitical situation being so close, obviously in the region, and economically dependent on China. I was interested in your points about economic security as from a deterrence point of view to deter bigger conflicts. That's perhaps something we can come back to as well. And on the point about the Australian government reaching out to business, I think that I'd actually quite like to ask each of you how that's going in your neighbourhoods. Perhaps, Rikako, if I can start with you on that particular issue. Investment screening imposes quite heavy compliance costs on companies, and governments are becoming more invasive in terms of what they want to know about what companies are doing. And of course, that sort of adds to the compliance costs. But there's not been much lobbying in Japan that I've seen anyway from business. I don't know, in favor of against this or trying to get clarity and so on, which is a bit puzzling. Could you perhaps outline how Japanese businesses are responding to these heavier compliance needs and the redefining of relations between government and business?
it's a difficult question. Well, in the past, before the emphasis on economic security took place, I think politics and economics were kept separate. So if there is an economic rationale, Japanese corporations will invest in and do business with nations that have different political regimes, for sure. But currently, we are seeing instances where the economy is used as a tool for political purposes. And we are entering an era where geopolitical and economic factors will increasingly intersect. So economics and politics are inseparable nowadays. So if the Japanese businesses are increasingly recognizing the need for a economic perspective in corporate management. So they now recognize that political tensions between nations could impact their operations. So of course, if investment regulations become stricter worldwide, it will create burdens for companies seeking to expand internationally. But I believe that as economic security advances, the restructuring of global supply chains could lead to perhaps new business opportunities. And additionally, compliance with regulations may add value or reputation by fostering a sense of security and credibility. So it appears that the approach to investment is entering a new phase in Japan.
Just one more question, if I may, to you, Rikako. We've heard from Helen on the autonomy and indispensability thinking in Australia, and we've heard from Sam on all the sort of the multiple instruments that are sort of popping up like mushrooms after the rain in the EU. And Japan's is seen as something of a thought leader in the area of economic security broadly, and so on. Do you see any room for international cooperation in the area of in this very broad area? Do you think it's possible to cooperate across the regions with like-minded partners?
Yes, I think it's very much necessary. And I saw in that question about the UK and Japan are working on setting up a new 2+2 framework for economic talks between their foreign affairs and economic ministers. And if those approaches, if they can deepen discussions on securing economic security and promoting free and fair trade against tariffs and achieve greater regulatory coherence, it could make things a lot more predictable for investors. So I'm very much hopeful about where these approaches might lead. And yeah, I believe the information sharing among like-minded countries is crucial for enhancing the predictability for investors and also for ensuring the credibility of regulators.
Thank you, Rikako. Sam, if I can may move to you. I've got sort of two questions in one. One is, could you give us your thoughts on how businesses and governments are managing the needs of economic security, perhaps in the EU or UK, if you pick some examples. And the second is around you talked about the focus on China, but the instruments being created under Trump 1. So the EU is sort of caught between sort of Charybdis and Scylla, trying to sort of navigate these two big players. How do you think the EU on trade, and perhaps if you've got time, the UK can navigate the pressures that are going to come perhaps under the second Trump administration?
Thank you. Also, beginning on the coordination point, I mean, just because there is a recent example of fairly effective coordination between the US, EU, UK, and Japan, and that's in the context of Russia sanctions, insofar as, you know, so say in Brussels, weekly meetings discussing what's going to happen, how it should be applied, and we can discuss the effectiveness of the actual application of the sanctions themselves, depending on what your definition of success is. But the coordination element of it was pretty good. Interestingly, that was not a formal collaboration, so it wasn't actually in a formalized setting. It was actually slightly informal, which made it easier for the Commission actually from an EU perspective. But in terms of business experience of economic security in Europe, I mean, it's not akin to what I know about sort of how it functions in Japan. It doesn't work very well at all. I mean, if we sort of take into if we discuss export controls, for example, in a UK context, for most companies, it's still largely a black box. You have companies that have been exporting something for 20 years to China, and now they can't, and no one will tell them why. It's not been a discussion. It's not been something that they've been taken along with. You also have the recent history, even in the UK, of the golden era with China. So you had an era in which essentially lots of Chinese investment into critical technologies was encouraged, and now all of those companies are being forced to sort of enter into processes to sort of get rid of their Chinese investors. It's not that coherent, and it's quite confusing, and that's just within the UK. If you go on a pan-European basis, and this is still staying with export controls are not applied uniformly in the EU. So you actually have differential application between member states. And there is no real desire by member states to centralize that competence within the EU because of the national security dimension. So within the EU, national security largely still remains a member state competence, and countries don't want to give that up. And it means that a company in the Netherlands might be prevented from selling something that their competitor in Germany is not. This has improved over the last couple of years, but it still is a slight issue. In the global context, there is a suspicion within Europe that the US's extraterritorial export controls are designed to penalize European companies to the benefit of US companies that receive derogations. I'm not commenting on whether that's true or not, but it is the perception. So they view them quite cynically as a sort of tool to essentially force them to exit the Chinese market, whilst lots of their US competitors are still able to sell because they benefit from some exemption, or they're not in the direct coverage, or they're not directly comparable product, but the thing that they produce can also deliver similar outcomes or produce the same materials. So there's quite a lot of suspicion. So I say that there's still a lot of work to do in Europe in sort of bringing the business community along and reducing their suspicion. The final point on this one is that there's also, from a business perspective, differential exposures. So if you are in a sort of if you're an advanced manufacturer and you're in the, say, semiconductor supply chain or chips or the like, or in EVs, you might have a begrudging degree of acceptance that there's going to be some forced decoupling from China at this point. If you're in the food and drink space, all you're seeing is risk, because you're worried that the tension that's completely, from your perspective, unrelated to you is going to spill over into Chinese retaliation against your sector. And even if you think about the recent EU EV subsidies, the first thing China did was institute its own anti-dumping investigation into French brandy. So it's just viewed as risk. So even governments then have competing lobbies essentially going into them and telling them different things about where the balance of risk and access should lie. On the Trump question, I mean, so the working scenario so there's obviously many scenarios, but in terms of what policymakers are thinking of in terms of the core scenario is Trump universal tariff as headline. This is combined with the opportunity for numerous derogations, exemptions at company level. There'd probably be sectoral specific level and also country specific. So it's an invitation to negotiate. So there's then a question of what does Trump ask of the EU? And there's essentially three categories of ask. I'm sorry to slightly plug. I wrote about this in the FT earlier this week, but and I also created something I called the MAGA index to identify which countries are most exposed to Trump's obsession with sustained bilateral trade deficits. It's slightly irreverent, but probably interesting. But the three categories are buy more stuff from the US, support the US in its global endeavors. So that's largely tariffs on China, but it could be other things. And then the category I've got is miscellaneous other. So this is make Trump feel good. So invite him to come see the king, stuff like that, which does have an impact on how he treats how he treats you. So if the assumption is that Trump is going to say, we will place 10 or 20% tariff on your exports unless you buy more stuff from us, treat me nicely, and put tariffs on China equivalent to us, what do you do in response to that? And the answer is, from both the EU and UK, negotiate. EU will negotiate, but with threats behind it. UK will just try and negotiate, and it's to try and find a middle ground on all of those issues whereby you can get to a point in which you placate him. And to conclude, one of the working examples people look at is Japan's agreement with Trump from the first Trump presidency, where Japan entered into a probably slightly illegal free trade agreement, and it doesn't cover substantially all trade, but who cares, in which they granted the US essentially CPTPP concessions on agriculture in return for not much from the US. But in doing so, allowed Trump to say, I've done a free trade agreement with Japan, something he liked to mention a lot and was really pleased about, and ensured that they were exempted from the initial Section 232 tariffs. So those are the sorts of examples. My other favorite example, and to conclude on this, is what then European President Juncker did last time around, where he went to see Trump, who he got on very well with, and said, we're going to buy more soybeans and natural gas from the US. In return, please don't put tariff on cars. And Trump said yes. Juncker had no powers to oblige the EU to buy more natural gas and soybeans. That was not in his competence. What he did was identify a trend, that it was happening anyway, and he could commit to it. And it happened, and it partially resolved a current issue based largely on personality and a bit of chutzpah. So this is the plan this time round, and we shall see if it works or not.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you for those. That's those 3 pointers for any government listening to how to manage after January next year. Thank you for that. Helen, before we go to questions, which we've got a few coming in, think about IPEF. I think it's clear that in the second administration, Trump administration, IPEF is it's on the its shelf life is very limited. But if the US withdraws from IPEF, that obviously brings the whole thing down, one assumes. But China may also consider the withdrawal from IPEF. Sorry, for our listeners, IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF. Withdrawal from IPEF as a sign of the sort of fragmentation of the US alliance in the region. And you mentioned, you talked in great detail about sort of Australia's sort of strategic location. But I wondered if do you think that IPEF has any, the collapse of IPEF would have any bearing on how China might be viewing the alliance system in the region, and also obviously with regard to Taiwan?
Yes, that's a great question. I mean, very first up to also talk about Australia's strategic location, because it links to Sam's points about how countries can really prosecute their interests with Trump. And I think falling into one of his first categories for Australia, for example, would be really talking about our real estate. So Australia hosts important military bases for the United States in the north of the country, in the Northern Territory. And we've also famously for a long time been a very important listening post for the US that has shared facilities in Central Australia as well that are important for the whole region. So you can imagine that alongside falling into category 3, things like golf, Australia famously used our Australian golfer Greg Norman as a kind of a way in with the Trump administration in the first term. These are really important ways for all countries to, I would say, to influence what Trump's thinking. Now, getting specifically to IPEF, yes. So I think you're right to bring it up. Trump has said he wants to pull out of it. I think that's possible. And in general, US voters are not very enthusiastic about more trade agreements, which is really different, for example, to a country like Australia, where the trade agreements enjoy really broad support. I imagine it might be similar in somewhere like Japan. So I think that the flow-on effect of that is certainly important, but IPEF has always been quite a light touch trade agreement. The ramifications for Australia of big economic choices that Trump could make will probably come to us via his actions directed towards China. I think those are the ones that are likely to have the big nearer term effects. So for example, really large tariffs that Trump places on Chinese goods, the flow-on effect to China's economy, which we know is already facing some pretty significant headwinds. Look at reductions in FDI there. The property sector issues are still sort of not quite ameliorated. Stimulus, but nevertheless, kind of patching holes. All of that, leads to reduced growth prospects in China, which for Australia, that's our big, that's the market that takes all of our imports of things like iron ore to make steel. And if construction is slowing down, that's not great for our economy. So that's probably more so than IPEF, just on the purely near-term economic front. That would be the big hit to Australia in the near term. But medium and longer term, and in terms of not just pure economics, but also this general sense of what's going on with the rules of the road and things like trade and investment, I do think that the US pulling out is really a bit of an own goal. So US domestic politics aside, in my view, that would be ceding US influence in the region. And getting to one of the questions that's come up in the Q&A, I do think that there's a role for countries like Australia, Japan, and others in the region to try and fill some of that void, although none of us are the US, but certainly to recommit with each other to wanting more trade liberalisation and wanting that ballast to just the sort of the growing economic heft of China alone. Now, on the final bit, your really important point, Robert, about, I think, Xi Jinping's views of all this. I do think that the US pulling out of IPEF would potentially send a somewhat of a signal to Beijing that there might be reduced cohesion among the US and its allies and partners in the region. And I do think that there's a possibility there of that emboldening basically Chinese policymakers in thinking about their plans for the region, whether it's Taiwan, but other plans to increase their power and presence as well. What I just would say, though, is it's a balancing act. And I do think that the US is likely to stay posturing strong on China. They may well widen the use of tools like export controls to things like drones and, yes, EVs and more products. So I say it's a balancing act because when you think about sort of the idea of deterrence, and Xi Jinping wakes up every day and is today the day he decides, for example, to make more moves on Taiwan, part of that calculus and balancing act will also be things like headwinds to China's economy, part of which it could be looking worse because of actions from the US directed towards China's economy. So I would say it's a bit murky what would happen on that front. And in fact, in some ways, a sort of a more aggressive, strong US kind of trying to kind of push China down could also have the effect of even speeding up Xi Jinping's timeline for Taiwan, or taking it in a forceful way, as compared to maybe a more sort of long-term approach that China seems to prefer at the moment, using things like information and psychological warfare instead. So I'll stop there on that. Very interesting question.
Thank you, Helen, for you're referring to Claudio Filippi's question, I think, about what role do you see Japan playing in building resilient supply chains in the Indo-Pacific region? I think you answered that, so thank you for answering that. And I just wanted to bring Rikako in on that as well. Do you see that does Japan, in this sort of changing environment, what's Japan's role in this kind of environment in building supply chains, resilience, and so on?
Well, I think Japan can do a lot, but Japan is sort of in between the United States and China. I'm sure the Japanese businesses see China as an attractive market, but at the same time, Japan is relying much on United States on the part of the national security. So, but instead of decoupling, I think de-risking is becoming more and more popular, and I think Japan can do much to do with like-minded countries and to strengthen supply chains.
Thank you, Rikako. We've got one which has got your name on, I think, Sam, about the future of global trade institutions under the second Trump administration. Do you have any WTO and so on? Any thoughts?
I mean, my short answer on that is I think, it's probably the moment to give up on achieving anything new in terms of the WTO. It's just about keeping it on life support. I mean, it's a reasonably high probability that Trump tries to leave. You can't rule that out. So I'm not sure we're going to be seeing any new ambitious negotiations or the like. It'll just be about trying to keep it going. And of course, I mean, there is an interesting dimension to this, right? Which is actually everyone talks about the WTO not sort of been broken for a while now, but its dispute settlement function, which everyone focuses on, actually kind of works for everyone so long as the dispute doesn't involve the US. As in, you do have alternatives. You have something called the MPIA, which the UK isn't part of, but might join at some point. But lots of other countries are. So, for example, in the EU-China EV investigation, that China's raised a dispute that goes through the panel process. There is actually an appeals function that can deal with that, so it can just go through this legal process. So, I suppose it's keep it on life support. Try and keep the US engaged. If they don't, try and decide whether it's worth just doing for everyone else, which is kind of what happened with TPP, where CPTPP rose from the ashes with the US's absence and continues onwards. Of course, you then have to develop other mechanisms to deal with the US, given its importance.
Thank you, Sam. I've got a question here. I think we're in our last 4 minutes, so I've been a very bad chair, and we're going to go over by about 2 or 3 minutes. So, audience, please hang on. But there's a couple of questions that I wanted to ask from the audience. One is from, I think this is for you, Helen, from Hekal, whose affiliation is Universitas Indonesia, from Indonesia. And Hekal writes, the re-election of Trump has raised concern that the US will reduce their economic involvement in the Indo-Pacific. If this concern is indeed manifested, could China fill the vacuum left by the US? Which is an interesting strategic question for not just for the region, I imagine, but for lots of other places as well.
Yep. I have a pretty succinct answer to that, which is yes. Hi, Carl. I do think that's certainly a possibility. And I would just add to that not only Trump sort of potentially pulling out economic involvement, but in fact, when the US is using things like export controls that affect semiconductor and other supply chains, remember that in some instances, firms in other countries are getting around that by taking out some of the production points in the supply chain that would have been in China, and say it's moving to Vietnam, or they're proportionately basically lengthening the supply chains, which actually draws more countries in the region closer to China, ironically. That can sometimes be a result of these US measures. So yes, I think that's certainly possible. Thank you,
Helen. And last 2 questions now. One from Kumiko Pivet. I think this is for you, Sam, about the UK-Japan economic 2+2 that's likely to get off the ground soon. And Kumiko asks, what would be the most likely domains of collaboration in any economic 2+2?
As a general point, I think the UK has quite a lot to learn from Japan, and I'm sure it's true in the other way, just given, sort of in post-Brexit, the UK has often been trying to look for comparable countries, but in terms of the nature of the economy, and obviously there are differences, but investment-based nature, broad-based, good services sector, some high-value manufacturing. Japan obviously does a bit better in that, quite a lot to learn. And in terms of the coordination, I mean, I know that part of the focus of these early discussions will be on things like subsidy design, where in the G7, Japan's been pushing different ideas around essentially a sort of subsidy union where you design them in a way that's non-discriminatory, but prioritizes certain components that lead to de-risking. And given what I said earlier about even how we've designed our EV decarbonisation scheme, the UK is obviously embrace quite a different approach. So I think there'll be conversations around that, and yeah, it's a useful endeavour.
Not non-discriminatory subsidies. I think that's another.
Well, so it's more. So I could go into more detail on this, but basically, how do you discriminate against China without saying with these subsidies are everyone but the Chinese? And the way you do that is you impose environmental obligations, supply chain obligations, obligations around the delivery of other things in the market and the like. And then after it all comes out, it goes, well, this is technically non-discriminatory. However, it contributes to resilience.
Thank you, Sam. And the last question from actually a former colleague of mine at the Economist Group, Natasha Xu, now at HSBC. And this is for you, Rikako, if we may. And and Natasha writes, increasingly corporates need to contend with national security screening of both inbound and outbound investment flows. Thank you for mentioning outbound investment flows, Natasha. We haven't talked about that so much. For example, the US's recent outbound order, the EU's white paper on outbound investment. Are other countries considering similar outbound FDI restrictions, and how should multinationals engage with diverging geostrategic interests between jurisdictions? So perhaps to be fair to you, Rikako Sensei, you can focus on Japan in that question.
Thank you. I am sure that outbound screening will be on the way, and it will be under serious discussion shortly, especially in the area of technology leakage. For example, when considering the issue of technology leakage, if only one country imposes regulations, the effectiveness is lost if the technology leaks from other countries. So if any kind of regulation is necessary, it's essential to approach them from a common standpoint. So I think all the countries, like-minded countries, have to deal with the issue together and come up with outbound investment, not too excessive, but at the minimum standard. Yes.
Thank you, Rikako Sensei. So we're 2 minutes over time, so apologies for that. We've run out of time, so we do have to wrap this session up. But thank you so much, Rikako, Sam, and Helen, for a really rich discussion. I think we found obviously a very volatile landscape, but I think we found some positives in this difficult world that governments and businesses are working in. And I'm sure our audience also took away some insights into this subject as well. So a huge thanks again to our speakers, and a thanks again to you, our audience, for logging in and contributing through your questions. We will make a recording of this webinar available on our website. I think that's generally done within 24 hours, and there will be a transcript to go with it. And we hope that you'll be able to join us for our next IISS Japan Chair program webinar in the near future. So thank you very much, and goodbye.